Oxford, Ohio, broadcasting steps away from Miami University, just outside the city of Cincinnati. You're listening to Don't Encourage This, a series of conversations with creatives, nerds, artists, theologians, and interfaith voices. I am your host, Marc Von Bullock. I'm a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. It's not every day you get to sit down with someone who can say that they have written one of our widely used translations of the Bible. I'm joined this episode by one of the preeminent Jewish scholars, I think quite possibly in the world. Professor Robert Alter serves as professor in the graduate school and emeritus professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1967. He is the author of 24 published books, including his achingly beautiful multi-volume life's work, The Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Council of Scholars of the Library of Congress, and is past president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics. He is a two-time Guggenheim Fellow, a senior fellow of the National Endowment of the Humanities and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. He has received the Robert Kirsch Award from the LA Times and the Charles Homer Haskins Prize for Career Achievement from the American Council of Learned Societies. This episode, Dr. Alter joins me to discuss one of the oldest and most challenging books of the Hebrew and Christian Bible, the Book of Job. The Book of Job is a complicated and challenging story in the Hebrew Bible, one that raises difficult questions for people of faith, such as, why do bad things happen? Why is there suffering in the world? How do we navigate tragedies and unexpected loss? These are universal questions that human beings have pondered for centuries, probably since the beginning of time itself. Dr. Robert Alter has dedicated much of his own scholarly work to studying these questions within the Book of Job from an academic perspective. But I also wanted to explore these questions from a spiritual perspective. Joining me this episode as my special guest co-host, the Reverend Chrissy Westbury. Chrissy serves as the associate pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Kalamazoo. She also serves as the associate presbyter of the Presbytery of Lake Michigan, and she is a dear friend of mine. Chrissy, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Chrissy, Dr. Robert Alter was generous enough to let me sit down with him for a few minutes to discuss this very singular book of Scripture, the Book of Job, from an academic and scholarly standpoint. We're going to listen to a few clips of that conversation together. However, the questions that are raised in this remarkable biblical text are so rich and so powerful and so profound. I also wanted to explore them from a spiritual perspective, from the point of view of a faith leader or maybe someone sitting in the pews. Chrissy, are you familiar with Dr. Alter's work? Have you used any of his commentary and sermons?
I mean, I think it's really hard to be a Presbyterian seminarian and not know Robert Alter's work. I definitely leaned on him when I was writing my exegesis exam. He was definitely part of every biblical interpretation class I took in seminary.
So we're going to listen in on a few moments from this conversation with Robert Alter, and then every few minutes, we'll take a short break to unpack some of the spiritual questions that this story raises for people of faith. I was really curious to ask him, why exactly did he want to write a new translation of the Bible to begin with? I mean, it's not every day that a Bible scholar just says, I'm going to write a brand new translation. Why would anyone want to do this? Let's take a listen. Dr. Alter, thank you so much for joining us on the program. It's a delight and it's a real honor to get to speak with you.
Happy to be here.
One of the great achievements of your lifetime of scholarly work, of course, is that you've produced for us a new translation of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary. And I know that one of the first questions that you get asked a lot is, why would anyone write a new translation of the Bible when there's so many wonderful translations already? One of those reasons, as you have said, is that so many of our translations of the Bible, as beautiful and as inspiring as they are, don't quite capture the rhythmic poetry and the beauty of the original Hebrew. I wonder if you could speak with us just briefly about why you think it is, what it is about the Hebrew that you have devoted your life's work to trying to convey for us, the readers.
To begin with, biblical Hebrew is a very compact language, and it's compact in two ways. One is there are not a lot of polysyllabic words. A typical English word going back to the Latin would be iniquity. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4 syllables. Whereas the Hebrew is avon, 2 syllables, a word that if you just listen to it, it has a certain punch.
That's much more compact.
Yeah. And actually, I translated that as crime, just 1 syllable, not just for the sound, but because the background of the term is judicial. And so when Isaiah uses it, he's thinking of expropriation of the property of the poor, murder, and so forth. They're more specific than iniquity. The other reason is Hebrew is what's called by linguists a synthetic, biblical Hebrew, a synthetic language, which means that typically instead of a pronominal object of a verb, you simply stick a suffix at the end of the word. And you can tell what the pronominal subject of the verb is simply by the way it's conjugated. So whereas in English we would use 3 words at least,
right,
in biblical Hebrew, you use 1 word. Now, this has a crucial role to play in poetry.
Yes.
Because poetry is all about rhythm. The various scholarly translators of the Bible in the 20th century more or less understand that, but they don't do much with it. The rhythm has a technical function in the Hebrew that is characteristic lines of biblical poetry have 2 halves that are symmetrical. It's been observed since the 18th century that the 2 halves are parallel in meaning, although not entirely parallel. The meaning is developed in the second half of the line, but they're also parallel rhythmically. Typically, each half of the line has the same number of beats, the same number of accented syllables. The most prevalent pattern is 3-3. So I try to do something with that too in my English, as I also tamped down the polysyllabic multi-word dimension of English.
I almost get the impression, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, I almost get the impression that a lot of our translations are in many cases striving for a very kind of literal translation of the text, but they miss out on that almost like the poetic storytelling of it, the rhythmic sort of cadence. That's sort of the impression that I've gotten from your work.
Right.
So, Chrissy, what do you make of Dr. Alter's remarks about wanting to offer a translation that leans more into the rhythmic poetry of the Hebrew as opposed to just offering a strictly literal translation?
So one of the things I think we lose in translation of the Hebrew scriptures in particular is the poetry, the humor, the wordplay. Anytime you read something in translation, you miss out on a lot of little pieces that the original authors put in because the language works the way that the language works. You can't do an updated version of Shakespeare and have it sound right because you lose iambic pentameter. It's that rhythm and that particular flow is so important that Shakespeare literally made up words in order to make that rhythmic pattern of the poetry work. And the Hebrew writers were the same way. They wrote in ways where they played with the words in ways that don't make sense in English, that we miss out on a lot of the humor, we miss out on the rhythm, we miss out on the musicality of the language. So when I was in seminary, we had a theater group on campus.
Oh, how fun.
And my very first year of seminary, we performed J.B. by Archibald MacLeish, which is a retelling of the Job story in dramatic form.
Wow.
And what's cool about it actually is that Archibald MacLeish wrote it in poetry. There's rhyme and there's meter, and every single line throughout the whole play is written in poetry. And so it mirrors the biblical Job in that way.
That's awesome. I didn't know that. That's really cool.
It's really neat.
What exactly is the plot of Job?
So essentially, it's the story of a person whose life goes completely off the rails. He is a faithful person. He is a good and righteous man. They say this over and over and over again as they set this story up, that Job does everything right, everything by the book, follows every law, is so faithful to God. And then we have this weird little story that happens between God and the adversary, where the adversary basically says, well, yeah, of course Job loves you, God. Of course Job praises you. Of course Job says all this stuff about you and sacrifices to you, and you've given him everything. He's rich. He's got all the food he could possibly need. He's got this fabulous wife. He's got all these kids. He's got servants. His life is perfect. I bet if you took all of that away from him, he would curse your name. And for some reason, God takes the bet.
Yes. Yes, he does.
The drama ensues.
Indeed. And of course, this story is in the Hebrew Bible for a reason. I wanted to ask you, from a faith leader's perspective, what would you say are some of the really difficult questions that this book raises for people of faith?
Well, I mean, the biggest question, of course, is the question of theodicy. If God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, why do bad things happen? And in particular, why do bad things happen to good people? You've got this righteous man, this man who does everything right, everything by the book, and God essentially toys with him, uses him as a pawn in this bet. It's really challenging to look at that and think, okay, what do we do with that? What do we do with a God that would do that?
And you used a very fancy church word a little bit earlier, theodicy, which is not referring to the Odyssey, the famous Homer poem that many of us read in high school.
And not my van either.
Yeah. This is a word, theodicy, which is it's a classic sort of churchy and theology word for exactly that dilemma that you described. It's that classic question of, why does evil exist and what do we do with that? And that's a question that people of faith have wrestled with for centuries, and this story kind of wrestles with it. So I wanted to ask Robert Alter what he makes of some of these questions in the story, and let's take a listen to what he has to say. So this conversation is about the book of Job. The book of Job is a very mysterious book of the Bible. And, when I was in seminary, the prevailing consensus that I understood was that this may be one of the oldest, maybe even the oldest biblical story written down, but it still seems very mysterious to me. What do we know, if anything, about the origins of this story? Who might have written it, where it might have come from, when, or do we know?
Well, we don't know a lot. We have to differentiate between story and poem. The bulk of Job, of course, is poetry.
There's a lot of poetry in Job.
Yeah, the story, which is generally called the frame story, is evidently an old story. There's no way of knowing how old it is.
Sure.
It probably circulated orally before it got to the hands of the Job poet. Maybe he had a written version, we don't know. The figure of Job gets a walk-on mention in Ezekiel as one of the three righteous men of tradition. The other two are Noah and Daniel, but that's not the Daniel of the book of Daniel.
Sure.
We know that in Ezekiel's time, which would have been the 580s, the 570s, before the Common Era, this story was a known entity. That's about all we know about it.
Right.
The Job poet was probably active sometime in the 5th century, that is about a century after Ezekiel, BCE. The clear evidence of that is linguistic. He uses quite a few Aramaic words, Hebraized, of course, and then certain words that only came into currency in what's called late biblical Hebrew. For example, the term for word in the Hebrew literature composed in the first Israelite Commonwealth is davar. It's a cognated word that means to speak. The word the Job poet uses for word is milah, milin, in the plural. And that appears to be a loan word from Aramaic. So we know the poem proper has to be relatively late.
So we have some hints of when parts of this may have originated, but we don't really know for sure.
Right.
I'm very interested in why certain stories endure throughout the ages and why other stories may have their day and speak to their moment of history and then sort of fade into the mists of time. Obviously, this is one of these stories that has endured maybe longer than any other story in the Bible. Perhaps, we don't know. Like you said, the frame story may have origins in oral storytelling,
Right.
but our predecessors clearly thought this story spoke to something in our human condition that was worth canonizing, that was worth preserving. Why do you think this story has endured for so long? Why do you think it ultimately speaks to us?
Well, for two reasons. First, it does raise the question of unwarranted suffering. That is, in our daily experience, we all know of, let's say, a child who dies of cancer, a woman who is crippled in an accident, and so on and so forth. And we don't know how to explain this, especially if you believe in a just and benevolent God. So the folk tale proposes a kind of explanation. God in the celestial gathering is challenged by one of the B'nai Elohim, literally the sons of God, which is not biological sons, but son in Hebrew has a very extended meaning. He's challenged by one of the members of the divine entourage who is mean-spirited, and he's called not Satan. That's a later development.
Right.
He's always called the Satan in the Hebrew.
It's Ha-Satan, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Satan means troublemaker or adversary. I translate it as adversary.
Yes.
So in the folk tale, you have a kind of explanation for unjust suffering, which is that there's this troublemaker up there, and he draws God into making this terrible wager. And then at the end of the folktale, this is also satisfying to the popular audience. It all gets straightened out.
Yes. Well, sorta.
God gives Job another set of children, including 3 beautiful daughters. He restores his wealth and his social prestige and so forth. So these two elements, I think, had popular appeal and kept the story rolling through several centuries. How many centuries? As I said, we don't know.
Sure.
Then along came the Job poet, who was both a very innovative poet. For my money, he was the greatest of all ancient Hebrew poets, and one of the greatest poets anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. And I include Homer and Virgil in that. So he was both a bold and innovative poet, and what went along with it, a bold and innovative thinker. And so he took this old story and broke it open, and he gave a voice to the suffering Job, and that voice radically challenges God's justice.
The way you're describing it, it almost makes me wonder if this could be the poet's way of saying, okay, I'm just speculating here, we have this old folk tale, as you call it, that has sort of attempted to give us this nice little fairy tale ending to a very challenging story. But as a poet, I may have some questions about this or some challenges about this, and the framework of poetry could give the poet voice to raise some of those questions for the readers. Is that fair to say, do you think?
Yeah. And I would say this, the fact that he's a poet, and not a garden variety poet, but a great poet, it means he could give voice to the acuteness of Job's suffering and to his moral outrage.
Yeah.
I mean, just as another great poet, Shakespeare, could have Lear blinded and rejected out on the moor in the storm say, I am bound upon a wheel of fire, my tears are scalding lead.
Yeah.
Which knocks the socks off you. You couldn't express suffering more powerfully.
No, certainly not.
When Job issues his death wish poem at the very beginning of the poetic part of the book, or when he comes up with lines accusing God, you don't even let me swallow my spit. You have a poet using the power of his poetry to express suffering and outrage.
Yes, very explicitly. Chrissy, I loved how during this last clip that we just listened to, we heard Robert Alter comparing the poetry of Job to Shakespeare, and you were just comparing the poetry of Job to Shakespeare. Great minds think alike, Chrissy.
Well, and not only is he absolutely right about that line from Lear being one of the great lines ever written in all of English literature, but Shakespeare also had a way, like the Job poet, of speaking into questions of the time in ways that you couldn't do if you were trying to tell a literal historical story.
Yes.
He had plays that were about the kings of England, that were about historical kings of England, that also named some of the evils of what was going on in his own contemporary time in a way that you could very easily get executed for in his contemporary time. But he got away with it because it was poetry and it was a play and it was a fictionalized version of past events. And so when Alter talks about this being a folktale, I think that that's really important. Because if we understand the book of Job as a literal historical story, then we really have to deal with that question of what kind of an awful deity is it that we worship? We have to deal with that question of God toying with God's most righteous follower.
Yeah.
Whereas if it is a poem, if it is a folktale, if it is a story meant to convey truth or ask questions about truth rather than a historically factual true story, we can accept that that piece of the story is necessary in order to advance the truth that's trying to be told by the poet.
And we know that poetry and folk tales and parables are very common in the Bible. I mean, just the most obvious example, of course, Jesus spoke in parables, or what we might call today folk tales, because they help us to think about questions and conversations that are much larger than ourselves in a narrative way, and they can help us to ask questions about these issues and to think about these issues and to dialogue about these issues. And I think the story of Job is very similar. It raises, as you say, issues that were very contemporary for Job's time, and quite frankly, they're contemporary for our time too. This issue of unwarranted suffering is something that we as people of faith experience, and also people who are not of faith. We all experience unwarranted suffering. And I'm sure so many of us at some point or another have asked, why me? Why did this happen to me? Why did I have to go through this? I'm sure as a faith leader, you've probably experienced that many times in congregations and churches.
Absolutely. Both with congregants going through dark nights of the soul, really difficult times. But it's really interesting too, how often this comes up in scripture. The number of people who have these sort of death wish prayers in scripture. I was thinking about this earlier today. Moses wishes for death. Elijah wishes for death. David wishes for death. Jeremiah wishes he'd never been born and curses the day he was conceived. Jonah throws a fit under a tree and wishes for death.
That's one of my favorite ones.
I love that one. Jonah's hilarious.
He's such a little punk.
He took wines. But over and over and over again in scripture, you have these moments where these people just reach the end of their rope to the point where they wish for death. And actually, I'm teaching a Bible study right now on the Apocrypha.
Oh, nice.
Which I had never really done a lot of work with the Apocrypha before. But last week I was teaching the book of Tobit. And the book of Tobit is very similar to the book of Job. It is understood by most scholars to be a fictional story that brings in some real historical events, but mostly it's a fictionalized tale. And it centers around this guy named Tobit, who has had, again, righteous man, does everything right. He's in exile in Nineveh. And he goes so far as to make sure that his fellow kinsmen, his fellow people in exile who are killed by the Assyrian government and just left on the ground, he makes sure that they get a burial and a burial following all of the laws and the rules. He gets in big trouble for this and is told he's going to be killed if he keeps doing it. And he keeps doing it. He risks his own life. And then one night he goes out and he sleeps in his courtyard because it's hot outside. And a bird comes along and sits on the fence next to him and pokes in his eyes.
Oh, no.
And blinds him. So this incredibly righteous man goes blind in this incredibly weird way and loses everything. So he ends up, lots of things happen. He has one of these death wish prayers. He prays to God that God would just end his suffering. At the same time, across the country, there's a woman named Sarah, a kinswoman of his, who has had 7 husbands. She's married 7 times, and each of her husbands dies on the wedding night before the marriage can even be consummated.
Oof.
So she's going through the same thing. If this is what my life is going to be, just end it, God. And of course, the story goes on and God provides and everything. They get their happy ending. They live into their happy endings and God rewards them for their righteousness in the end, which is what happens in Job. To a point.
Yeah, there's definitely some similar themes that we see popping up. You were mentioning a number of examples in Scripture where we see these questions pop up, talking about poetry. The Book of Psalms has, when we think about the Book of Psalms, of course, there are the handful of Psalms that all of us know by heart. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And these are beautiful pieces of poetry, but we often forget there's 150 Psalms. There's at least, 147 more. And some of them are not always all that happy-clappy. They get very, very dark and angry, and you can hear the pain of the poet's life really expressed in ways that are not always comfortable to read, but they're true and they're honest and authentic. So this is clearly a very important theme in Scripture and in our lives as people of faith.
It's one of the things I love most about biblical poetry. Biblical poetry encompasses and includes the entire depth of the human experience, the human emotional experience, the heights of joy and the depths of despair. It's all in there.
Absolutely. Well, let's listen to another clip with Robert Alter as we dig a little bit deeper into some of the details of this poetic story. We were talking about the heavenly entourage. I wrote down your translation here. A man there was in the land of Uz, which I think is such a lovely translation. It almost feels like the start of a nursery rhyme, where I think you used the word folktale a little earlier.
Right. And the Hebrew sounds like that.
Yeah. We meet this character of Job, who is described to us as blameless and upright and feared God and shunned evil.
Right.
So right up front, we're established, this is a good dude. This is someone who probably, by our standards, would not deserve the ordeal that's coming to him. And then we have this gathering of the heavenly entourage before God, and Ha-Satan is there too. Now, I wanted to ask you about this gathering of beings. In the Christian tradition, we use words like angels and things like that. But I get the sense that as the Hebrew Bible developed, this concept is a little bit more complicated than that. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Who are these characters that are having their weekly staff meeting with the Lord?
Sure. It's conventionally thought that the Hebrew Bible is a rejection of pagan mythology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's true in a limited sense. The limited sense being there are no longer specific gods and goddesses that are operative. The God of Israel is the supreme ruler of everything. But you don't get rid of mythology that easily. Mythology is very appealing. Milton in Paradise Lost, and Milton certainly was a devout Christian, he clung to mythology and associated the struggle between divine figures with Homer and with Virgil. So you have in a few places these vestiges of a mythological concept of God and his surroundings in the monotheistic system of the Hebrew Bible. For example, right at the beginning of Genesis, God says, "Let us make a human in our image."
In our image.
Right.
Like, who else is there?
So that's a puzzle. But I think the puzzle was correctly solved by, he may not have been the first one either, by Rashi, the great medieval French Hebrew commentator back in the 11th century. He says, our image, he consulted his entourage.
Yes.
And uses this Latin loan word, familia, which is cognate with family, to indicate the heavenly entourage. So I think that's what it's about there. There are a few peak-in places in the Hebrew Bible where this entourage appears. I think it's Psalm 80. Sometimes I get my Psalm numbers fixed up. If it's not 80, it's 83. You can correct this in the editing.
You're not being graded for this. It's all fine.
Right. God takes counsel in the assembly of gods, and then he rebukes them for not administering justice on earth. And at the end of the psalm, he says, because you've done this, you're going to be demoted. You're going to be just like ordinary noblemen. You will be mortal like noblemen. So no more gods.
Wow.
It's that tradition, that vestigial mythological tradition that you see in the frame story of Job. And because it's a folktale, the mythology is more explicit than it is elsewhere.
Sure. So it sounds like as our faith traditions were sort of moving gradually away from polytheism into sort of the direction of monotheism, we still see traces of that in these biblical stories here and there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That traditions have perhaps maybe chosen to understand in different ways as we go back and read them today. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly.
Chrissy, this is one of these examples in podcasting when I have an opportunity to interview somebody like this and I go back and listen to it later. I get a little self-conscious because I can hear myself geeking out in my own voice, and it's not always the most flattering because I love this topic. I think this topic is so fascinating. These questions around some of the characters in stories like this, like these other heavenly beings that we as Christians have often interpreted as angels, but they may have their origins in other mythological places. What do you make of this? I just find this so fascinating.
I just love the image of the heavenly entourage. Like that brings a whole different picture into my mind than anything I've ever thought of before.
Like a Lady Gaga song.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But no, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Like this question of the pluralization of God in the creation story, these different images that we get these images in Isaiah. There's a number of places where you get these images of God with sort of the heavenly realm and others around him. Big Trinitarian, big mystic here. And so for me, whenever I think about God, I cannot think of God as a solo being.
Yeah.
Anyway, because I don't think of God as ever being a solo being. Mechthild of Magdeburg talks about the Trinity existing before creation.
Yes.
And that the Trinity existed in this like perfect love relationship that she describes as sort of the constant flow of love dancing around one another. And that's spilled out into the creation of the human soul.
That's beautiful.
So while, yes, I am a monotheist because I am a Christian, God is too big to be summed up in a solo finite being. God's edges are a lot blurrier than that.
Well, I also think when we look at holy texts, whether it's the Torah or the Christian Bible or the Quran or whatever it may be, religion, I think, is ultimately our attempt to live into a mystery that we ultimately can't understand. We are certainly in relationship with this mystery, but, none of us as mortals can claim to know the mind of God completely. And I think that, the concept of the Trinity, of course, this episode is not about the Trinity, but that's another sort of Christian doctrine, or some might call a paradox, that's very difficult to wrap our mind around or even understand.
Have me on again when you address that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think religion does that. It's our best attempt to give voice to our relationship with a mystery and a God that is ultimately much larger than any one of us. And we might see little traces of that in stories like this one.
Yeah.
I just think it's all very interesting. But speaking of questions around the story, we're going to play another clip from my conversation with Robert Alter, where we're going to start to wrestle with some of the more difficult questions in this story. Let's take a listen. You mentioned something earlier, that God gets drawn into this wager with Ha-Satan. I love that translation used the troublemaker. I've never heard that. I know you translate the adversary in your book, but when I was in seminary, Ha-Satan was sort of, I guess, understood almost like in a legalistic way. Like if there's a heavenly court, there must be a prosecuting attorney somewhere. And
yeah, that makes sense too.
Yeah, but I love troublemaker. I that's so good. But you mentioned earlier, God gets drawn into this wager with him. God initiates this conversation with Ha-Satan about how wonderful Job is. Reading from your translation here, there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. And later on, God says, still clings to his innocence, which I think is so beautiful. And the adversary kind of says to God, well, duh, he has this perfect life. Why would he question his faith in you when he has everything a person could want? I bet if you took everything he had from him, he would change his tune pretty quickly.
Right.
And instead of telling this troublemaker to kick bricks, God says, want to bet? And they make this wager together. Why do you think, I know this is pure speculation, but why do you think God goes along with the wager? Why not just tell the Satan to buzz off and leave him alone? I suppose this is one of the great mysteries that's puzzled theologians for centuries. Does Job deserve to be a pawn in this heavenly chess game?
No, he certainly doesn't. I'll give it a kind of simple-minded response to that.
Sure.
That if God didn't go along with the wager, the story wouldn't work.
Yeah, we'd have a very short Bible story. It's fair enough.
In the old folktale, the framers of the folktale are not thinking in cogent theological terms. They tell a story in which, God has a kind of weak moment. He wants to show this annoying character that Job really is through and through good. So he says, okay, I'll take the wager.
Yeah, one way that we might say this. So why does God go along with the wager? Because the story needs him to go along with the wager.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, Ha-Satan, Satan, the troublemaker, wastes no time and immediately gets up to his mischief. Job is struck with a horrible series of catastrophes. His property is destroyed, his children are killed, and then in chapter 2, Ha-Satan goes back again for round 2 and strikes Job with this horrible burning rash from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head.
That's it.
And his wife said to him, do you still cling to your innocence? Curse God and die. And we see this very human expression of pain and grief from Job's wife and also from Job as this suffering unfolds. I wonder, as faith leaders, I think so many of us who have read and studied and preached this story across the ages see this as, in some ways, a story of universal human emotions that Job feels in the midst of unimaginable loss that he doesn't fully understand. And we have gone through moments like that in our own lives where we've experienced loss that we can't understand. It seems to me that this story is sort of trying to engage with those feelings and those questions.
Oh, absolutely. That comes across powerfully when we switch to the poetry. When Job begins to speak, we're aware from what's happened in the frame story that this is a man who has lost everything.
Mm-hmm.
He has lost his children. He has lost his wealth, livestock, basically. He's lost his social standing. he's reviled for his suffering because people conclude that he must deserve it if it happens to him. And then he's lost his physical integrity with this terrible rash, burning rash that afflicts his body. So he begins to speak. And it's something that I think many people have experienced. I've gone through dark moments in my life.
We all have.
We all have, right? I've never been pushed quite that far.
Sure.
But one understands that people do have this feeling, my life is so miserable, I wish it were over.
Yes.
And Job, speaking in the hyperbolic mode, which is prevalent in biblical poetry, which is he had never been born. More than that he had never been conceived.
I wish the whole day had been blighted from the calendar.
Right. That's the way his argument starts.
That's a wonderful point, because when we do go through those dark moments, whether they are necessarily as dark as Job's or not, when we go through tragedy and loss, our emotions do feel heightened. And I think poetry is a wonderful way of giving voice to the way that our heightened emotions feel when we're going through seasons like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Which is probably why we relate to the poetry so deeply.
Sure.
Chrissy, you talked a little bit earlier in our conversation about these universal human emotions that we do feel, like loss and tragedy and grief. As we were listening to this clip with Robert Alter, it occurred to me that these are often emotions that we don't talk about in church very often. When we walk through the doors of a church, I suppose we still feel this temptation to try to project a more polished, idealized, perfect version of ourselves. This is exactly the stuff that we kind of want to keep under the rug, that we don't want our neighbors to see. And yet this is a story that sort of brings all of that into broad daylight.
I call it putting on our Sunday best.
Yes.
It's more than just the clothes we put on. It's a mask that we sometimes are tempted to put on when we walk through the church doors. And I think it's true for pastors. It's true for parishioners. I think we are taught as children to be on our best behavior at church and not let the negative feelings out. And I think that we learn that. And it's a shame, because that should be the place that's safest to engage emotion and to engage these very real questions of human experience.
Absolutely. And we have to be able to give voice to those feelings. I mean, it's not healthy for us to keep them bottled up inside, much less to feel like we're alone in them, or to have this sense that this is something I can't share with a loved one or a friend or a family member. When we're going through stuff like this, we have to be able to bear that pain with somebody. Otherwise, it'll just eat us alive.
Scripture teaches us to lament, to cry out to God in our pain, to lay everything at God's feet, the good, the bad, the ugly. When we don't do that, I think we negate some of God's power. I think we make God smaller than God is if we think that God can't take us at our worst. I mean, God knows it all. If God can't take us at our worst, who can?
Yeah. It also sounds like maybe these stories give us a model for how to do that, for how to have these conversations, and to tell us in Scripture's own way that it's okay. It's not only it's okay, but it's spiritual to be able to give voice to these feelings and emotions. I want to go back to that first question that Robert Alter talked about in that clip about why God agrees to take this wager with Satan, Hasatan, the adversary, whatever you want to call him in the first place. His response is that from a narrative perspective, God takes the wager because the story needs him to do that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a story. What do you think about that? What was your reaction to that?
I think that's a perfect answer. I think that's exactly right. And it's kind of what I was saying earlier, because if we look at this as a strictly historical, literalistic story, then we really have to deal with that question. Like, what kind of a God does this?
Right.
But when we recognize that it's a poetry, that it's a folktale, that it's trying to get at a deeper truth, we realize that that's not something we really have to spend time on, because that's not what the story is about. It's a narrative tool to move the story forward.
And there are many parables in Scripture. If we jump to the Christian New Testament for just a minute, if we think about the parables of Jesus, there are certainly parables that are very familiar to all of us. The parable of the prodigal son, just about everybody knows that one. The parable of the widow and her lost coin, and da-da. But there are other parables in the Bible that may be less familiar to some folks sitting in the pews that just get real weird, where just sort of like the human logic kind of breaks down, and you find yourself reading them thinking like, what in the world is going on? And it's because they're trying to get at questions and symbolism that are complex. And this is a story that certainly, I think in its own way, the logic of how we like to think about God is very different in this story, but it's trying to get, at the end of the day, the story is trying to get us to think about questions of grief and pain and suffering, but it's very weird. It's a very weird story, Chrissy.
It is.
After all these things happen to Job, there's this lengthy part of the story where Job's friends and companions show up, and they try to offer a lot of different theological explanations as to why bad things are happening to him. And some of them are very familiar to us. They go through the whole gamut of, well, if something bad happened to you, you must have done something to deserve it, Job, or maybe if you just prayed a little harder. And all of these explanations get debunked by the end of the story. But that's another thing that we as humans see, even in faith communities, when someone's going through a season of grief. I've certainly had well-meaning friends or family members who have trying to have something to say when you're going through something like that. They don't know what to tell you, and something comes out of their mouth that may or may not be the most helpful, and that's exactly what happens to Job with his friends.
Well, it's so hard because you want to say something. You want to say something comforting, something to, give them another perspective. And honestly, in times of this deep of grief, there is nothing you can say.
Sure, of course.
Like, there's no way to make it better. So oftentimes the things that come out of our mouths are less than helpful.
Well, and hopefully, we can. My gosh, I'm sure I've said plenty of things to my own friends and family when they've been going through seasons like that were less than helpful. It's human. I mean, we've all done it. We've all been there, and we've all been on the receiving end of it. Yeah. But I will say one takeaway that I get from this story, and I try to say this from the pulpit too, is that as well-intentioned as that might be, it's probably not very helpful. Sometimes the best thing to do is to just sit with someone and try to be a compassionate listening ear or a listening presence, and try to resist the temptation to explain it away, because a lot of times we just can't.
Well, and that's where the friends start in Job's story. At this point, Job has lost everything. He's in sackcloth and ashes. He's tearing at his hair. He's sitting on like a pile of soot in deepest grief, and his friends come and they just sit with him.
That's right.
And that's where they start, is they just sit with him in his grief. And that's where they get it right. And then they open their mouths and mess it up.
They almost got it right. They came this close.
They started so well. But I mean, that's natural too. I mean, I have done this myself, like sitting with somebody in their time of grief, just really trying to be there for them and just be a presence for them. At some point, you sort of get uncomfortable and you feel like you have to say something in the silence. Yeah, sometimes that's a mistake.
Yeah. I can remember, I'll share this very quickly. Years ago when I was in seminary, I worked as a hospital chaplain during my what's called clinical pastoral education training. And sometimes, I'd go to visit patients who were very conversational, and some patients just didn't talk much for whatever reason. Maybe it was a physical reason, or maybe it was their personality. And there were times where I just did not know what to say. And I'm sure, being a young guy in seminary who's not very experienced in this, I'm sure I said tons of stupid stuff that just didn't help. Or maybe it did. I don't know. But all that is to say, it's very human. It's a very human impulse. And hopefully there's grace for all of us in that.
Absolutely.
But sometimes it's better to just keep your mouth shut if you can help it. So yeah, Job and his friends are trying to they're trying to get down to the heart of the matter, which is, why is this happening? And in this next clip with Robert Alter, that's exactly the question that we're finally going to get down to. Why do bad things happen? What is this really all about? Well, speaking of getting into Job's argument, it's about in chapter 2 that we meet his three companions: Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. I hope I didn't obliterate those pronunciations.
We don't know what these peoples are.
That's what we always say in preaching. However you pronounce it with authority, and the audience will say, sure, that's probably right. And we begin this very lengthy middle section of the book that carries on for, I think, 29 chapters or so, or 34 if you count the business with Elihu, who shows up later.
Right.
And we get this lengthy discourse about basically trying to answer the classic question: why do bad things happen to good people? It's one of the most basic paradoxes of our faith. I think you mentioned this earlier. If God is good and all-powerful, then why would God allow these sorts of things to happen? And if bad things happen, then is God open to human critique? Or is God perhaps not as omnipotent as some believers have been raised to believe? It seems to me this is one of the oldest questions in our faith.
There's a wonderful expression it's actually Aramaic, or a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, which comes much later in the history of post-biblical Judaism. Chutzpah klapei shmaya. We all know the word chutzpah because it's gotten from the Yiddish into America. It's chutzpah toward the heavens.
Oh, wow.
The heavens being a circumlocution for God.
Yes. So it's almost like saying having chutzpah towards God.
Yeah, instead of God.
Yeah.
And this is an authorized sentiment by some of the rabbis. In other words, if you're outraged by what has happened to you, you should not lie to your own experience in order to save God's reputation.
Yes, I understand.
And that's what the three comforters do. That's really their role in the book.
You mean to say that they are trying to preserve God's reputation and kind of shush Job from having all these dark, messy feelings?
Yeah. At the end of the book, God says to the three comforters, I don't remember exactly how I translated it, so I'm thinking in the Hebrew, you have not spoken the thing which is right, has my servant Job.
It sounds like that's sort of God admitting in a low-key way, Job may have a point here. Job may have a kernel of an argument. Am I hearing that right?
It's in chapter 42. He actually addresses Eliphaz. My wrath has flared against you and your two companions, because you have not spoken rightly of me, as did my servant Job. I think that what God means is not really the accusation, which is repeated very powerfully in the poetry many times, that God is an unjust God, that he destroys the righteous and not the wicked, and so forth. That is not true, but Job is being honest. He's being honest to the pain of his own experience, and this is something that the three friends have not done.
When God says Job has spoken rightly, what God might mean by that is Job has given a real and authentic voice to his pain. I may or may not agree with the accusations that he's laying before my feet.
Exactly. That's very well.
But he's doing the right thing by not repressing himself, by not pushing those feelings deep down. He is being honest. And to give voice to our pain is very healthy. We probably shouldn't bury those things deep down. That's how we run into problems later on. It sounds like you're suggesting that God is acknowledging that.
Yeah, so that sentence at the end is important to remember.
Yes. I'd never thought about that. I just assumed that when God said Job has spoken rightly, that was code for, Job and I had our little talk, and Job has apologized, and he's taken back all the nasty things he said about me, and now he's fine. And so you're saying that you don't think that's what God means by that?
Yeah, I don't think, yeah.
In my tradition, the Christian tradition, this can be for some a very uncomfortable conversation to have. I think there's a sense among many Christians that, God is good all the time, and all the time God is good. Many of us are often taught to never question the Almighty, much less criticize. But it seems to me, as you were sort of mentioning earlier, in the Hebrew tradition, there does seem to be some openness at times to a sort of critical thought or critical conversation when it comes to God's choices, God's character, God's motivation. That's sort of what that chutzpah to the heavens represent. I mean, do you think that's fair to say, if even just looking at these stories in a literary sense?
I'd put it in a historical context. The Hebrew Bible has, many books, according to the canonical Hebrew count, 24 books. Those books were composed over a period of at least 8 centuries. Some of the old poems go back 9 centuries before the latest book, which is Daniel. By the way, that's quite unlike the New Testament, where everything was written in a few decades.
Sure.
That means there are different voices. I don't know that the school behind Deuteronomy would have approved of Job's argument.
Sure, fair.
Oh, and also, maybe we should throw this into the hopper. There is a different concept of God, humankind, and creation. When you get to the voice from the whirlwind,
yes,
it's an amazing piece of poetry, I have to say.
Oh my goodness.
What you have is the anthropocentric concept of the world, that is the first humans in early Genesis who were told that they will rule over all things, all creatures. That's gone.
Yeah.
Humankind is sitting up in the bleachers while God carries out this grand display of the dizzying variety and power of the created world. And that's quite different from Genesis 1-2.
Yes.
There seems to be either the invention or the invoking of a slightly different creation story. At creation, when the sons of God sang together.
I was just thinking about that.
A wonderful line, and there's nothing like that in Genesis.
No, that doesn't happen. It's beautiful. It's like the celestial beings are just having like this choral moment celebrating the creation, which, as you said, is magnificent, but it never happens in the creation stories that we know of, at least.
As time went on, there was space in the Hebrew tradition, which of course was a religious tradition, for different voices and different viewpoints.
Absolutely. Chrissy, what do you make of that little mention in chapter 38, verse 7 of the sons of God, or these heavenly beings shouting for joy during the creation of the world? As Dr. Alter pointed out, that doesn't happen in either of the creation stories in Genesis 1 or 2. He seems to hint that this story may be alluding to a slightly different creation story altogether. What do you think about that?
Well, again, it goes back to this idea of this being a folktale and something that's been passed down in oral tradition over generations before it gets into the hands of this poet. My undergrad was in anthropology, studying lots of people groups all over the world, lots of cultures. And one of the things that I often say to folks is that theology, religion, these stories that we tell about how we experience the mystery of the divine are people wrestling with their own experiences and trying to put human words to them.
That's beautiful.
And it's hard because none of it is actually capturable in human words.
Yeah.
So as we think about all of these different pieces of different stories that are shared by people in different cultures, I mean, the people who wrote this story, the people who shared this story didn't exist in a bubble. Realistically, their land was constantly being taken over by some empire.
Sure.
They were being taken into exile here and taken into exile there. They were experiencing trading relationships with lots of other people groups. They didn't exist in a bubble with only their own stories. And so they heard and shared stories with other cultures, other people groups. And so little bits and pieces that make their way into what become our stories. I actually think that that's really beautiful. and speaks to the connective nature of the human experience.
That's wonderful. That's so cool. Well, and I also loved this expression that Robert Alter used, chutzpah before God, or chutzpah before the heavens. I'd never heard that before.
That's so great.
I thought that was so lovely. And it's an interpretation of this story that I've never heard or considered, that at the end of the story, God says, let me look it up really quick. The text says, Job has spoken rightly before God, which I'd always assumed meant that, well, Job apologized. He said mean things, and now he's taken it back, so we're good now. But Robert Alter sort of offers this different take, which is, regardless of whether God may or may not agree with these accusations, God is essentially telling Job, it's good that you gave voice to what you're feeling. It's good and healthy that you were honest and sincere and spoke from your heart, even if it's hard or messy. And shame on your friends for trying to get you to shush and bury all that deep down. God seems to be affirming this practice, even if God may or may not agree with all the nuances of what Job has to say. I thought that was that just blew my mind. What did you think about that?
Well, it's funny because it makes me think of when my kids were little and, establishing boundaries with my kids. You give them rules, you give them guidelines about what they're supposed to do. But the biggest thing we always told them is you'll never be in as much trouble if you tell the truth.
Oh, that's nice.
No matter what you've done, if you are honest about it, if you come to us, say, I screwed up, I need your help fixing it, you will always find compassion and grace, and you will never get in as much trouble as you do if you try to cover it up and hide what you're feeling and hide what you've done. Honesty is always going to get you out of whatever mess you've gotten yourself into quicker and less painfully.
Yeah, and that's true. That's a beautiful example, Chrissy. And that's true for us as adults too. And sometimes it's hard for us to be honest or to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. You're talking, of course, in the context of children, but even as adults, when we walk through those church doors, there's something about walking into that building that just makes us think, okay, maybe I shouldn't let all that stuff come out right now. I need to be on my best behavior. And it seems like this story is trying to get through to us to say we can't make our way through the healing process without being honest about our pain and what's going on. The more we try to deceive ourselves or others, the harder it is for us as humans to heal. It sounds like maybe that's really what this story is trying to get at.
It's wonderfully permission-giving and comforting. The people that God corrects, the people that God chastises, are the ones that are saying all of those things that we think of as sort of the right things to say.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderfully permission-giving. In the Archibald MacLeish play, the three friends, the three comforters, they're cast just a little bit differently than in the original story. In the biblical story, they actually represent history, science, and religion.
Oh, interesting.
And so each of the friends, they use some of the same language that's in the Bible, but they bring in the ways that we justify and argue against trusting in God in a more contemporary society. This was written in, I want to say 1958. It was somewhere around then. And so it brings in, you're dealing with all of this stuff going on. How do we explain it? And JB is explaining it by trusting in God in some way. And his friends come in and they talk about like the historical context of all of the terrible stuff that's happening.
Sure.
And the scientific reasons. They bring in religion. They try to get him to think about it from all these different ways that are really not helpful to Job in the moment. They try to get him to basically intellectualize his pain and his grief when he's just trying to feel it.
Which is something that we as modern Christians often do. We try to intellectualize our pain.
Yep.
When really the best thing we can do is to just feel it.
Yeah.
It's the harder thing to do. It's the more painful thing to do. But it's if we want to heal, truly, a lot of times that's the best thing to do.
Yeah.
Chrissy, before we play this final clip, I want to address the elephant in the room, which is the ending of this story. We haven't talked about the ending of this story yet, but I want to talk about it before we play this last clip with Dr. Alter. This starts in Job chapter 42, verse 9. And the Lord showed favor to Job, and the Lord restored Job's fortunes. This is after this whole ordeal has taken place. And the Lord increased twofold all that Job had. And then later on, Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Robert Alter hinted at this a little bit earlier. I feel like this text is trying to present us with a sort of fairy tale ending, but I find it a bit hollow. It feels to me like the story is trying to say Job went through all this horrible stuff and he suffered needlessly, but it's okay because God made it all better and gave him new kids. And I'm kind of sitting there like, I don't think that is okay. What do you think?
So going back to the play again, the Archibald MacLeish play, I remember there's a moment at the end of that one where JB is talking to the adversary character, and the adversary is telling him sort of how it's going to come out in the end. And he talks about his wife, and JB says, I have no wife, because she's left him at that point. And he says, the adversary tells him, she comes back to you. And JB says, I have no children. And the adversary says, you'll have better ones.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's not that far off from what it says in the Bible.
I know. And then there's like this little evil chuckle that comes after that. But what's interesting is in the play,
you'll have better ones.
Yeah. In the play, the adversary is basically trying to convince JB that he should just end it. And the God character is going to restore everything. And JB in the end says, no thanks, I don't want anything to do with either of you, and finds solace in the arms of his wife. And it's just the two of them at the end. And that's where it ends. You don't see the full restoration in the play.
Oh, interesting.
Which I find really fascinating. And I think that the reason he does that is that he's addressing this very question. Because you can get your money back. You can get your health back.
Sure.
You can't replace your children with new children. It doesn't work that way.
No, certainly not.
And you can't take away the pain and the trauma that you've experienced. Even if your life gets back on track, you can't negate the trauma that you've experienced.
Absolutely.
I think about the collective trauma that we as a society have experienced through the COVID pandemic.
Oh my goodness, yes, which we're still processing.
Exactly. And we're at a point where we're largely back to sort of normal patterns of behavior. But we're still carrying that with us. And there's going to be an impact of that on society. There already is. But how that plays out over time, I don't think we can know yet. But just because we're largely back to normal patterns of behavior does not negate all of the people who died, all of the people who continue to suffer with long COVID symptoms, all of the people with immune disorders that still can't function in a way that society expects them to snap back to because everybody else did. And the emotional trauma that goes along with all of that.
Absolutely. Well, I asked Dr. Alter about this question of what do we make of the ending of this story in my conversation with him, and we'll listen to his answer in a moment. But I want to read a bit from his commentary on this part of the story. As countless readers have objected, this doubling of property is scarcely adequate compensation for all Job's sufferings, and even more so, the 10 new children scarcely heal the wound of the loss of the first 10 lives. But the book ends in the folktale world of the frame story, where everything is reduced to schematic patterns and formulaic numbers, and perhaps in this world, such a question cannot properly be asked. Now, before we hear Dr. Alter's remarks on these closing moments, when I read that bit from his commentary, I can't help but wonder, what questions is this folktale asking? And I feel like it's asking questions about grief, but maybe, I don't know if it fully offers satisfying answers. Do you have any thoughts about it, Chrissy?
I've never been satisfied by Job.
Yeah, sure.
Because it gives you this pat ending that leaves you feeling a little bit hollow. Maybe that's part of the point. Maybe you're supposed to be left feeling a little bit hollow, a little bit empty, because maybe you need to recognize the fact that there are no easy answers to these questions. You can't wrap it up in a neat little bow. Any answers that we come up with are going to leave us feeling a little bit dissatisfied.
Well, and if nothing else, it gets us talking about these issues and it gets us asking questions about it, which I've always sort of thought is kind of the point of parables in general, not just the book of Job specifically, but I feel like, Jesus's followers, when he would tell them parables, they would say, what do you mean by that? And Jesus just be like, just vanish. Just like, I gotta go do something else. Why don't you guys think about it for a second? I don't know. If nothing else, it does get us wrestling with these difficult questions. But let's listen to this final clip with Dr. Alter, where I ask him some of his thoughts about the closing of this story. Before Job and his companions have this lengthy argument, there's a moment, my dear friend and colleague, the Reverend Chrissy Westbury, pointed this out to me the other day, that way back in chapter 2, verse 11, the text tells us the story almost doesn't go this way. At first, Job's friends meet to grieve with him and to comfort him. And in verse 13, they sit with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights and never spoke a word to him, for they saw his pain was very great. And then later on, after God sort of restores everything, there's a very interesting line. I think it's right before God restores Job's children. Yes, it's in chapter 42, verse 11. Job has this gathering in his home with all his male and female kinfolk and all who had known him. And the text says they broke bread with him and in his house and grieved with him and comforted him for all the harm that the Lord had brought upon him. It seems to me that there's this sort of, that's almost what his friends do. Well, and for a little while they do that. But it seems to me it's really in that moment when Job's friends and companions and loved ones are able to surround him and really hear him and care for him that his healing can begin. That ultimately the sort of cosmic mysteries and questions, that may be the answers that Job wants, but it seems to me they don't ultimately really help him very much. It's ultimately just in the listening ear and in the compassionate presence that healing is really able to take place. I wonder if that's maybe kind of a valid reading of this story. I mean, when we go through those dark moments, we may want answers, but they don't ultimately help us very much in the end, it seems.
I think what you said is very aptly put, that a crucial part of Job's suffering is that he has become a pariah. He speaks about that a couple of times. He says that I was once an honored and revered figure, and people listened to my words the way you wait for dew, and now everybody reviles me. So his reintegration into a community that sympathizes with him, I think, is crucial for the quote happy ending.
Yes. Even though as a happy ending, it's still a little bit of a dubious one. And I think you even pointed that out in your commentary that,
Right, sure.
It's wonderful that God gives him new children, but that doesn't quite fix the pain that we feel with the loss of the first 10. But
Right. You don't replace kids the way you replace a wrecked car.
No. But I suppose in some ways that's the story just trying to wrap itself up.
Yeah, right.
Dr. Robert Alter is the professor in the Graduate School and Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California in Berkeley. His stunning translation, The Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary representing a lifetime of scholarship in the Hebrew texts, is available from W.W. Norton & Company, wherever books are sold. Dr. Alter, this was such a privilege and a delight to get to speak to you in this way.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I appreciate the aptness and the sensitivity of your questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That's going to just about wrap it up for this episode of Don't Encourage This. If you would like to hear more conversations like this one, you can check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts, or you can connect with the program at don'tencouragethispodcast.com. I'm Marc von Bullock. Until next time, thanks again.